experts couldn't repair a complex ship engine. Until the Admiral brought a brilliant Navy veteran, the USS Vanguard. A state-of-the-art naval destroyer lay motionless at Norfolk Naval Base. Its sleek hull, a silent testament to its sudden failure. The ship's advanced hybrid propulsion engine, a masterpiece of modern engineering blending diesel and electric power, had inexplicably shut down during a routine patrol in the Atlantic. The crew, a mix of grizzled veterans and eager recruits, fresh from training, stood on deck, their faces etched with frustration and uncertainty as the ship's heart refused to beat. For 3 weeks, the Navy's best engineers, alongside a team of civilian contractors from Apex Systems, had descended on the engine room. Their laptops, diagnostic tools, and endless streams of data had failed to uncover the root of the problem. The air was thick with tension, the clatter of tools echoing in the confined space, and the chain of command was growing increasingly impatient. Whispers of failure spread through the ranks, and the pressure from higher-ups was unrelenting. Admiral John Haskins, a weathered officer with 30 years of service etched into his lined face, stood on the bridge, his eyes fixed on the idle warship. His stoic demeanor masked the storm of thoughts in his mind. The Vanguard was a linchpin for an upcoming NATO exercise, a critical display of naval power that allies and adversaries alike would be watching. Every day the ship sat in dock was a blow to national security, and the Pentagon was hounding him for answers. He'd pored over the technical reports. The engine's control system was spitting out erratic error codes. The fuel injectors were misfiring in chaotic patterns, and the cooling system was overheating for no apparent reason. The contractors, with their advanced degrees in proprietary software, had thrown up their hands in defeat. One of them, a senior engineer with a clipboard perpetually in hand, had muttered about a fundamental design flaw, suggesting the entire engine needed to be torn out and rebuilt from scratch. Haskins didn't believe it for a second. He'd served on ships with engines far less sophisticated and far more temperamental, and he knew there was always a solution if you knew where to look. He turned to his aide, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Ruiz, a sharp officer with a reputation for getting things done. Her dark eyes met his, and he spoke in a low, firm voice. "Sarah, get me the file on Chief Petty Officer Daniel Carter." Ruiz's brow furrowed, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. "Carter, the retired machinist, sir. He's been out of the Navy for 10 years, lives down in Virginia Beach, doesn't he?" "I know," Haskins replied, his tone unyielding. "Get him." Ruiz nodded, though her expression betrayed her skepticism. She knew Carter's reputation, everyone in the Navy did. He was a legend among machinists, the kind of man who could coax life back into a dead engine with nothing but a wrench in his instincts. But he was also a wildcard, a man who'd left the service under a cloud of bad blood. Still, Haskins' orders were clear, and Ruiz wasn't one to question them. She saluted and left to make the call. Daniel Carter was 62, living in a modest house in Virginia Beach with a view of the ocean that stretched endlessly before him. His hands, calloused and scarred from decades of turning wrenches, told the story of a life spent in engine rooms. His gray eyes carried the weight of countless sleepless nights, diagnosing problems under the hum of ship machinery. Carter had retired after 25 years in the Navy, where he'd earned a reputation as a genius with anything mechanical. If a ship's engine could be fixed, Carter was the one to do it. He'd saved vessels from disasters that would have sunk lesser men's careers. But his time in the Navy had ended bitterly, after a clash with a commanding officer who'd dismissed his warnings about a faulty repair. That mistake had nearly cost lives, and Carter, a man who didn't tolerate incompetence, had walked away. The Navy's bureaucracy, with its endless forms and rigid protocols, had worn him down to the bone. He'd vowed never to return when Ruiz pulled up to his house in her Navy-issued sedan. Carter was in his garage, elbowed up in the guts of an old Harley-Davidson. The air smelled of grease and gasoline, and the radio played a low hum of classic rock. He looked up as Ruiz approached, her dress blues crisp and her posture rigid. "Chief Carter," she said, her voice steady but respectful. "Admiral Haskins requests your assistance." Carter wiped his hands on a rag, squinting at her through the afternoon sun. "Haskins, that old bulldog still barking orders. What's he want with me?" Ruiz stood her ground, unfazed by his gruff tone. "The USS Vanguard's engine is down. Nobody can figure it out. He thinks you can." Carter let out a short, humorless laugh, tossing the rag onto a workbench cluttered with tools. "I'm retired, Lieutenant. Tell Haskins to call his fancy contractors with their shiny laptops. I'm done with Navy nonsense." Ruiz didn't blink. "Sir, the Admiral said you're the only one who's ever fixed a hybrid propulsion system like this. The Vanguard's critical to national defense. He's asking for one last job." Carter's jaw tightened, his fingers flexing instinctively around the wrench in his hand. He didn't care about medals or flag-waving speeches anymore. Those days were long gone, but the thought of a ship sitting dead in the water, its crew stranded and helpless, hit him in a place he couldn't ignore. He'd spent his life keeping vessels alive, feeling their pulse through the steel deck. The idea of walking away while a ship like the Vanguard sat broken gnawed at him like a bad tooth. He met Ruiz's gaze, his voice gruff. "One job. One Job, Ruiz confirmed, her tone unwavering. Carter exhaled sharply, setting the wrench down with a clank. Fine, but I'm not saluting anybody. He grabbed his toolbox, a battered metal case that had seen more engine rooms than most sailors, and followed Ruiz to the car. The engine room of the USS Vanguard was a labyrinth of pipes, cables, and machinery that should have been alive with the steady hum of power. Instead, it was quiet, save for the frustrated muttering of engineers and the occasional clatter of tools against steel. Carter stepped aboard, his boots echoing on the deck, the familiar smell of oil and metal filling his lungs. The space was crowded with contractors from Apex Systems, their laptops open and their faces drawn with exhaustion. At the center of the group was Dr. Emily Voss, a propulsion expert in her late 30s, clutching a clipboard like a shield. Her sharp eyes locked onto Carter as he entered, and her voice cut through the room like a blade. "Who's this?" Carter set his toolbox down with a heavy thud. "Daniel Carter, Haskins called me." Voss's eyes narrowed, her lips pressing into a thin line. "The Admiral didn't mention anything about a consultant. We've got this under control." Carter's gaze swept over the silent engine, then back to her. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Doesn't look like it." The room went still, the tension thick enough to choke on. A young ensign named Patel, barely out of the academy, stifled a laugh, earning a withering glare from Voss. She stepped closer to Carter, her voice dropping to a low, icy tone. "I have a PhD in mechanical engineering and 15 years with Apex. I've designed systems more complex than you've ever seen. Mr. Carter, we don't need some retired grease monkey mucking things up." Carter didn't flinch, his eyes locked on hers. "Fancy degrees don't fix engines, lady, wrenches do. Now, you gonna let me work, or you wanna keep flapping your gums?" Voss's face flushed red, her knuckles whitening around her clipboard. Before she could fire back, Admiral Haskins appeared in the hatchway, his presence commanding instant silence. "Enough," he barked, his voice cutting through the room like a whip. "Dr. Voss, your team's had 3 weeks and zero progress. Carter's here because he's fixed engines you've only read about in manuals. Let him do his job." Voss's jaw tightened, her eyes burning with resentment, but she stepped aside, gesturing to the engine with mock courtesy. "Be my guest, Mr. Carter. Maybe you'll find the gremlin we've missed." Carter ignored her, kneeling by the engine's control panel. His fingers traced the wiring, his eyes scanning for anything out of place. The hybrid propulsion system was a beast, a fusion of diesel and electric power controlled by a computer, smarter than most of the people in the room. But Carter didn't trust computers. He trusted his hands, his ears, and the instincts honed over decades of keeping ships alive. He opened his toolbox, pulling out a multimeter and a worn notebook filled with handwritten schematics, the pages yellowed but meticulously detailed. "Ensign Patel," Carter called, not looking up. "Get me the diagnostic logs from the last 48 hours. Patel hesitated, glancing at Voss for approval. She nodded reluctantly, her lips pressed tight, and Patel hurried off. The other engineers watched Carter, some with curiosity, others with thinly veiled skepticism. One of them, a younger contractor named Harris with a cocky grin, leaned against a pipe. "You really think you can fix this in a day? We've been at it for weeks." Carter didn't look up, his fingers probing a bundle of wires. "You've been chasing your tails. This ain't about throwing code at the problem. It's about listening to the machine." Harris laughed, a sharp dismissive sound. "Listening, it's a ship, not a symphony." Carter's eyes flicked up hard and unyielding. "Engines talk, kid. You just don't know the language." Patel returned with a stack of printouts, and Carter spread them out on a nearby crate. The diagnostic logs were random temperature spikes, inconsistent fuel pressure, and error codes that seemed to contradict each other. He muttered to himself, cross-referencing the data with his notebook, his pencil scratching notes in the margins. The other engineers hovered, some whispering among themselves, others pretending to work while stealing glances at the old man who seemed unfazed by the chaos. After an hour, Carter stood, his knees creaking, and pointed to a cluster of sensors. "Near the fuel injectors, these are your problem." Voss crossed her arms, her voice dripping with skepticism. "We checked those sensors. They're fine." "They're not," Carter said flatly. "They're miscalibrated. The computer's getting bad data, so it's choking the fuel line." Voss let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "Miscalibrated? Those sensors are factory sealed. You can't just tweak them like an old carburetor." Carter ignored her, grabbing a wrench from his toolbox. "Patel, shut down the auxiliary power. I'm going in." Voss stepped in front of him, her eyes blazing. "You're not touching my engine without a full diagnostic review. We have protocols." Carter's voice dropped, cold and deliberate, each word like a hammer. "Your protocols have this ship dead in the water. Move, or I'll move you." The room went silent, the other engineers frozen in place. Haskins, who'd been watching from the sidelines, stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Dr. Voss, stand down, Carter. Do what you need to do." Voss's jaw clenched so hard it looked like her teeth might crack, but she stepped aside, her eyes never leaving Carter. He climbed into the engine compartment, his movements precise, despite his age. His hands moved like they were part of the machine, disconnecting the sensors and testing their outputs with his mop. He found what he'd suspected. 2 of the 6 sensors were sending erratic signals, throwing the entire system into chaos. Using a small tool from his kit, he adjusted their calibration, his fingers steady and sure. He reconnected them up, each connection before climbing out. "Power it up," he called to Patel. The ensign hesitated, glancing at Haskins. "Sir, we need to now," Carter snapped, his voice cutting through the room. Patel flipped the switches and the engine room came alive with a low, steady hum. The crew froze, hardly daring to believe it. The hum grew into a roar, the Vanguard's engine pulsing with life. The younger sailors erupted into cheers, their voices echoing off the steel walls. But Voss's face was a storm cloud. She pushed past Carter, her hands flying over the control panel, checking the readouts as if she could will them to prove him wrong. "That's impossible," she said, her voice shaking with disbelief. "You didn't even run a full diagnostic." Carter wiped his hands on his jeans, unfazed. "Didn't need to. I know this engine better than you know your own name." Voss spun on him, her voice rising to a near shout. "This is reckless. You could have fried the entire system. We have procedures for a reason." Carter stepped closer, his voice low and cutting. "And your procedures failed. You're so busy staring at screens. You forgot how to listen to the ship. That engine was screaming for help, and you ignored it." The room went quiet again, the other engineers watching the standoff like it was a boxing match. Voss's face was flushed, her hands trembling with barely contained fury. Before she could respond, Haskins raised a hand, his voice calm but final. "Enough. The engine's running. That's what matters. Dr. Voss, your team will verify the fix and run a full diagnostic. Carter, you're with me." In the Admiral's office, Haskins poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot that looked older than the ship. He handed one to Carter, who took it with a nod. The room was small, cluttered with charts and reports, but it felt like a sanctuary after the chaos of the engine room. Haskins leaned back in his chair, studying Carter. "You're a pain in the ass, Dan, but you're the best I've ever seen." Carter took a sip of the coffee, his expression softening just a fraction. "They're too reliant on computers, John. Machines don't lie, but software does. Those kids need to learn that." Haskins nodded, his eyes distant. "I know. That's why I called you, but you stepped on some toes down there. Voss is already drafting a complaint to Apex, probably to the Pentagon too." Carter shrugged, unconcerned. "Let her. I didn't come here to make friends." "You came to fix my ship," Haskins said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "And you did, but I need more. The Navy's changing. Dan, these new systems are too complex for most of our guys. I want you to train a few. Pass on what you know." Carter leaned back, his eyes narrowing as he set the coffee cup down. "I'm not a teacher, John, and I'm sure as hell not coming back to the Navy full-time." "Not full-time," Haskins said quickly, leaning forward. "Consultant 1 year, you pick the crew, you teach them your way. No bureaucracy, no bullshit. Just you and the machines." Carter stared at the coffee cup, his fingers tracing the handle. He thought of the Vanguard, of the way the engine had roared back to life under his hands. He thought of the young sailors, their cheers echoing in the engine room, and of Ensign Patel, who'd hung on his every word. He thought of the sea, the hum of a ship under his feet, the one place he'd ever felt truly alive. 6 months, he said finally, his voice gruff. "And I don't salute." Haskins grinned, a rare flash of warmth in his weathered face. "Deal." Over the next 6 months, Carter took a small team of machinists under his wing, including Ensign Patel, who followed him like a shadow, soaking up every lesson. He taught them to trust their instincts, to feel the ship's pulse through the deck, to listen to the subtle groans and hums of the machinery. He showed them how to read an engine's quirks like a doctor reading a patient's chart, how to spot trouble before it became a crisis. Voss and her team stayed on, their presence a constant source of tension. She never forgave Carter for showing her up, and their interactions were a study in barely concealed hostility. But even she couldn't deny the results. The Vanguard sailed through the NATO exercise without a hitch, its engine purring like a contented beast. Allies praised the ship's performance, and the Pentagon sent a quiet note of approval to Haskins. Carter never wore a uniform again, and he never saluted. But his presence lingered in the engine room long after he left. The sailors he trained carried his lessons forward, their hands steadier, their ears sharper. They became the new keepers of the Vanguard's heart, a living reminder that sometimes the old ways, grit, instinct, and a good wrench could outshine even the most advanced technology. Carter returned to his house in Virginia Beach, his toolbox a little heavier, his heart a little lighter. The sea still called to him, but for now, he was content to let others answer.